We've talked about a lot in the previous talks about hard tissues like bones and shells and things like that, and how those get fossilized and what we can tell from the hard parts. But we haven't talked too much in detail about how paleontologists study the softer parts of extinct animals and how we learn about the parts that themselves don't preserve all that well, but they might leave traces behind on some of the bones. What we have today is we have an expert joining us that's going to teach us a little bit about how we make inferences, how we make decisions and hypotheses about the soft tissues that don't often preserve based on the hard parts that we do have. So today, I think it's going to be a really great topic. We are all going to learn about dinosaur brains. So any of you zombies out there, you should be really excited about today's topic. So our guest today is Dr. Ashley Morhardt. She is an assistant professor of neuroscience at Washington University School of Medicine. So she is joining us today. She got her bachelor's degree from Illinois College, her master's degree from Western Illinois University, and her PhD from Ohio University. So thank you, Ashley, for joining us today, and we're all really excited to hear what you have to tell us about dinosaur brains.
Great. Hello, everyone. How are you? So nice to see you, and so nice to be invited to do such a fun and special activity. I know our world is a little crazy right now, but it's nice to have a chance to talk about things that really get our hearts pumping and get our minds racing about, these giant and wonderful animals that existed millions of years ago and still exist today as birds. Yes, we'll be talking about dinosaurs and specifically talking about what we know about their brains. And I have a presentation to share. I also have some props, so we'll be talking about dinosaur brains using some props. My first question, especially to the kids out there, is where is your brain? So when we think about our brain, we think about it being inside of our heads, and we think about it being not just inside our heads, but under our hair, under our scalp, under our skull, which is the bone in our head, and deep inside there is our brain. So our brain is going to be this squishy bit of tissue that is about the size of our two hands put together, a little bit bigger than that, but about that size. And it does a lot for us. And so our brain is going to be protected by our skull, and it's going to be connected to our spinal cord, which runs down our back inside our backbone. So it does all kinds of things to help control how we move and how we think, and we'll talk more about that. So let's see if I can advance this. Here we go. So as I said, our brain sits inside our skull, so we can see our brain kind of pictured here. Here's our head, right? And here's our big brain sitting inside of our head. And our brain is going to help us with things like sensing. So sensing means using our five senses. So things like seeing and hearing and tasting and touching and smelling. So those things all are controlled by our brain. Our brain also helps us move. It helps us think. It helps us decide. It helps us choose what we'd like. So if we'd like chicken nuggets or pizza for lunch, that is something that our brain helps us to do. It helps us to eat food and to drink water or other things. It helps us to breathe, sleep, talk, and it helps us understand our feelings. So if we're happy or sad, our brain helps us understand things that are going around us and how we feel about what's happening in the moment. So you can see these pictures, right? We have our kids running, so their brains are helping them run. We have our kids writing and reading. The brain is helping them do that. And here we have our little baby eating, and his little brain is helping him eat. So the next question I have for you is, are dinosaurs real? This is a question I get a lot, surprisingly, because I think people think that dinosaurs are kind of like dragons, where they're pretend. But actually they are and were very real. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we know that they were real. And as was already mentioned by our opening and also in previous talks, we know a lot about dinosaurs based on their skeletons. So here we have the skeleton of a Tyrannosaurus Rex, and this is mounted in a museum. And we know a lot about the shape and size of Tyrannosaurus Rex, as well as things like its behavior, what it maybe ate, how it walked, things like that, based on the skeleton. When you think about dinosaurs, maybe you think about how these bones came out of the ground, right? So we paleontologists typically go to different locations around the world and we dig up dinosaurs out of the ground and we take them to museums to clean them, to prep them, and then put them up for display or study them for research. And so, yeah, these fossils come out of the ground and we learn about the size and shape of dinosaurs from that. And ultimately, what we're interested in doing is thinking about dinosaurs as they were when they were alive. So thinking about, you know, how they behaved, what they ate, how they moved, how they interacted with one another, and how they evolved. And so we have all of these different clues based on the fossils that we dig out of the ground and study, but we also have clues based on the animals that are related to dinosaurs. So modern animals like birds and alligators and crocodiles, these animals we know based on their bones, we know that they were related to dinosaurs that were extinct and were living in the Mesozoic. So we know some about dinosaurs from their fossils, and we know also about them from their relatives that are alive today. So when we talk about soft tissues, like the brain, soft tissues are going to be kind of like the skin or other pieces of anatomy, like the tongue, right? Or say the inside organs, like your lungs or your heart. These things are all soft and they aren't bony. And so they typically don't leave fossils behind for us to dig up and study. So we often rely on the relatives of dinosaurs, things like birds and alligators, so that if we study their soft tissues, we can say something about maybe what dinosaurs in the Mesozoic would have had, so whether or not they had lungs or hearts. And we do know a fair bit about this. So you don't have to read everything on this slide, don't worry about it. But here we can show you the inside of T-Rex. We have neck muscles, we have internal organs here by the rib cage, things like the heart and the liver and the stomach and the intestines. These are all organs that you have inside your body, and T-Rex and other dinosaurs would have had also. And like I said, we know this because we know about the internal organs of things like birds and gators. So when it comes to studying soft tissues, a lot of times we don't have a bony evidence directly. So it's not like studying, say, the hip bones, right? Because the hip bones are going to fossilize. But we can show where, say, the muscles attached to the hip bones based on markings on the hip bones, and also how we see the muscles in alligators and birds. So we use all of these pieces of evidence to kind of assemble and reconstruct soft tissue anatomy in dinosaurs. Okay, so do dinosaurs have brains? Because if we don't have fossilized brains, or if we typically don't, how do we know that they had a brain? Well, like I said, we know that birds and gators have brains, so that's your first clue. And we also know that inside the skull of dinosaurs, if you look inside the skull, there's a hole, there's a cavity inside the skull that looks a heck of a lot like a brain, so the size and the shape of a brain, and it's right where we would expect that brain cavity to be. So we do have some good evidence, and you can see the brain cavity here. This is the skull of Stegosaurus cut in half lengthwise, and we have highlighted in red, this is that brain cavity inside the skull. So it doesn't really look like our brains. It's kind of long and narrow, but you can see that that's right where we would expect the brain to be. If we look in Triceratops, this is kind of just a drawing, but you can see the black area here, that's where that brain cavity would be. And if we look sort of a top-down view, we see that cavity also here that's deep within the skull, that's going to be where we would expect the brain to sit. And also this cavity, it's an empty space, but when we look inside, we can see, if we take a look at the Stegosaurus skull again, we can see that there are sort of features on the surface of this cavity inside the skull that look a lot like things that we would expect to be there close to the brain, things like blood vessels, things like nerve canals. So all these other soft tissues like nerves and blood vessels also leave their mark on the bone. And so we can start to get a sense of the size and shape of the brain, not only based on what we see in living dinosaur relatives, but also based on what we see inside this cavity in the skull. This shows the skull cut in half. So a lot of times paleontologists really don't want to have to cut skulls in half that they find in the ground, because skulls can, depending on the species of dinosaur, they can be really rare. Also, if we don't have to cut them in half, even if they're not rare, then why would we, right? We want to keep those fossils as complete as possible. So in order to study the brain cavity without cutting the skull open, what folks who study the brain cavity like me do is we take those fossils to a hospital. And here, this is not a fossil, this is a person, but you can see this young man is getting his hand x-rayed. So perhaps maybe he fell and hurt himself, and this is an x-ray machine that's kind of like a camera. So it's going to be taking a picture. Here's the camera up here. The picture is taken up here, and this is the technician helping position his hand in the right place. And then there's sort of like the camera film is down in here in this box. And so as the picture happens, there are x-rays that are emitted or shot out of this box and pass through his hand and into the large box below. And what we end up with is a nice picture of somebody's hand here with all of the bones inside. And you can see features of the bones without having to cut his hand open, which would be bad if we don't have to. So kind of like the dinosaur skulls, we want to get a sense of what's going on inside without having to open up his hand. And so here, luckily, it shows that there are no broken bones. So hopefully he can just have an ice pack and be okay. So let me show you now, we're moving on from the little boy to, this is not a full skull, but this is a partial or a part of a skull of a dinosaur. This is of Triceratops. So the three-horned dinosaur, horns up on the head and one on the nose. And you can see that it's passing through this tube here. So we've taken this partial Triceratops skull to the hospital. We've placed it on this bed. And this part of the skull is going to pass through this ring. And as it passes through the ring, there are going to be several x-rays that are taken, several pictures that allow us to look inside of this partial skull and see the brain cavity inside. So here you can see it's, positioned in the scanner bed. This is a CT scanner or computed tomography, if you will. So fancy name for x-ray. And we're passing passing the fossil through that. And we're seeing, here we are, all of these scientists huddled in a little room behind the scanner, watching as this fossil passes through. And here we are, here's a picture taken behind us, and we're watching the x-rays pass through the fossil, and we're looking for the brain cavity on the inside. And you can kind of see, it's sort of hard to see, but you can kind of see, we're starting to see dark spots in the fossil, and that's part of the brain cavity because it's filled with air. the bone, the dense bone, that's not going to be the cavity, that's going to light up brightly, like we saw with the little boy's hand bones in that x-ray before. So here we go. So we're moving on. So what do we do with these x-ray pictures once we're done with them? So we're going to have the Triceratops here. Like I said, we didn't scan the whole skull, we just scanned a part of it. And we can take that part of the skull and we can now, using those x-ray pictures, make a model, a three-dimensional computer model of the partial skull. And we can use computers to fill in that cavity inside the bone. So you can see they're kind of these like purple globs sticking out of the cavity here. So those are parts of that cavity that are kind of sticking out from the bone. So once we take the bone away, then we have this purple sort of alien or bug-looking structure. This is the size and shape of that cavity inside the skull. And we'll talk a little bit about all of the different features on here and what they mean. But this structure, this is going to be sort of like taking bubble gum and filling in that cavity and then pulling that bubble gum out. And here you can see these different pieces that are sticking out. Those are pieces sticking out from that brain cavity. So this whole thing is called a fancy word called an endocast. Endo means inside, and cast is kind of like when you make you take a mold and you fill it with something. That thing that it's filled with is a cast. So this is endocast, and you can see right here we have a little walnut for scale, because a lot of people think that dinosaur brains are about the size of a walnut, and as we'll see in a little bit, it's actually more like 2 walnuts for some dinosaurs. So it's still pretty small, but I wouldn't want them on my trivia team. Let's put it that way. But we can see that our walnut is a little bit of an underestimate for the size and shape of the brain. Okay, so now that we have this endocast, which is basically the size and shape of a dinosaur brain, we can take a look at the pieces on here. So if we use colors to show different features, we have blue here, this dark blue, that's going to be for veins. We have red here for arteries. We have yellow for nerves. And we have pink for the inner ear. The rest of this kind of light blue color, this is the brain cavity proper. And so the skinny end over to the right-hand side of your screen is the nose end. That's close to where the olfactory centers are that allow for smelling. And then the back end to the left, that's going to be where the brain connects to the spinal cord, sort of at the back of the head towards the neck. So pointing to the right-hand side of the screen, that's going to be front. And then we have left is going to be the back end. So what's kind of cool is that in addition to nerves and blood vessels in the ear, we can see other areas of this brain cast that are for different areas of the brain. So this front end here, that's going to be for the cerebrum. The cerebrum is what allows us to do thinking and choosing, and it also helps us understand our emotions. So this is this sort of circular area right here. Back here close to the ear, that would be for the cerebellum. That's for things like balance. And right here, this area that's kind of long and skinny sticking out from the bottom of the endocast, that's for the pituitary gland. So that's for things like helping you understand when you're thirsty, and also for giving off chemicals that help you grow. So as you get older and bigger and stronger, the pituitary gland is going to help you have the chemicals in your body necessary to grow. So we can take a look at our list. Remember, we talked about what your brain does, things like sensing, moving, thinking, choosing, eating, drinking, breathing, sleeping. So these are things that would have been true for dinosaurs as well. So the dinosaur brain, based on what we know about the cavity, the brain cavity, and what we see in birds and gators, all of these things are true. The only things that are kind of up in the air would be down here, things like talking. So probably dinosaurs vocalized, would have made noises just like birds and gators do, but certainly they weren't walking around having conversations with each other like we do. And then they probably experienced certain types of emotions, or feelings. So maybe they would have felt scared, or they would have felt content. But it's kind of different from the feelings we feel. We have some pretty intense and complex feelings. So a little bit different from from what we would experience. But the point is that based on what we know about dinosaur brain cavities and what we see in birds and gators, there's a lot that we have in common between our brain and a dinosaur's brain. So a question I get a lot is, how many brains did a dinosaur have? So there's this myth that dinosaurs like Stegosaurus had maybe 2 brains, so one in its head and one in its tail. And that's actually a myth. And so dinosaurs would have only had 1 brain in their head. Each dinosaur would have only had 1 brain. And then the area in the tail where we used to think a second brain would be is really just it would have held part of the spinal cord, which is a little bit enlarged and would have allowed the legs to move. That those nerves would have been you need to have really big nerves to run those big legs. And also that area of the spinal cord that was increased in size by the legs would have been covered in sort of a gelatinous or kind of like jello material that would have provided nutrition to that area of the spinal cord. So we have a lot going on in that area, but it's not a second brain. They only had 1 brain. So that's what I have for you guys, and I am so excited to take some talks now, or some questions now. Mindy asking, what's the smallest dinosaur brain? And so that's an interesting question. So a lot of times we think of dinosaur brains in terms of being small for the size of the animal. So the smallest dinosaur brain would be from the smallest dinosaur, roughly, because in terms of body size, that would dictate a lot about brain size and vice versa. So probably something that would have been bird-like would have had the absolute smallest brain. But in terms of the brain to body size, actually things like Triceratops have very small brains for their body size. And so I kind of like to joke that ceratopsians are unique in the fact that they had extremely small brains. And we usually think of like Stegosaurus. Stegosaurus is pretty famous for having a tiny brain for its body size. But what's interesting is when we do mathematical comparisons of brain size to body size across reptiles and even across birds, dinosaurs end up having brains in general that are about the size that we would expect for their body size. So even though if they seem kind of like they have small brains for their body size, based on what we know about things like other reptiles that are alive today and even birds that are alive today, the brain size is actually not that small. It's pretty on par with what we'd expect. And so, we like to joke that some dinosaurs were kind of stupid, and fair enough. I don't think they were solving calculus or genius level smart, but they were smart enough to survive. and that's what's important. So let's see here. What's the biggest dinosaur brain? So again, this is an interesting question because the question is it the biggest dinosaur brain in terms of absolute size, or is it in terms of comparing brain size to body size? And when we talk about the biggest brains absolutely, that's a good question. I don't know specifically species, but having worked with things like hadrosaurs, so the duck-billed dinosaurs, they have some really big brains in terms of absolute size. And also they have really big cerebra. So their thinking processing area was quite large too. In terms of absolute size, or I'm sorry, relative size, so brain size to body size, we would be looking at dinosaurs that are more on the bird line, so things like Troodon. So if you've ever seen a dinosaur train, that's going to be the conductor on Dinosaur Train is Troodon. And so the reason why he's set as the conductor is because Troodon's going to be known for being a very smart dinosaur because of the fact that it had a very big brain for its body size. And so things like, Velociraptor too would have had a very big brain for its body size. But like in Jurassic Park, they show these dinosaurs opening doors and being trained to hunt in packs. And that's kind of an exaggeration, probably, of what they were capable of doing. Now, whether they hunted together in groups is a good question, but whether they were, testing fences and opening doorknobs is probably an exaggeration of what they were able to do.
Which dinosaur had a brain the size of the 2 walnuts?
So, good question. So that would be something like even Stegosaurus, the brain size would have been roughly the size of like 2.5 walnuts. A young Triceratops would have had a brain about that size. So something like juvenile age Triceratops. Let's see, what else? Protoceratops, that would be another one that had about a 2 walnut brain size. Let's see. Yeah, lots. There would be a lot that would fall into that category. The dinosaurs that have a little bit bigger brains than that would be things like sauropods. A lot of sauropods have bigger brains, but that makes sense because they're large animals also. Things that would not fall into the 2 walnut category would be hadrosaurs, and like even Pachycephalosaurus has a larger size brain. But basically a lot of the herbivores and a lot of the small sized more bird-like dinosaurs would have been in the close to the 2 walnut category. Yeah. Anything else?
Okay. There was a question, could you go over again why people would think that dinosaurs had 2 brains?
Oh, okay. So that's a long-standing question or issue about, probably close to, let's see, gosh, probably close to 120, even like farther back, like 140 years ago. There were discussions in the research literature about whether or not dinosaurs like Stegosaurus had a second brain. And this was because as you traced the canal for the spinal cord from the brain cavity down through the vertebrae, the backbone, to the hips, that canal widened to be almost the size of a second brain. And so one of the hypotheses that was developed at the time was that perhaps because the brain cavity in the skull was so small compared to what they felt like they should be seeing, that this cavity in the hips and the sacrum was kind of making up for the fact that the brain cavity in the head was so small. So we now know a lot more about the anatomy of things like birds and alligators, and also just the fact that that would be unprecedented. To have a second brain in the body for a vertebrate animal is not something we see in nature. And so, but we do see an enlargement of the spinal cord in that area in a lot of vertebrates, including humans. And so what's much more likely is that the spinal cord just enlarged to put out nerves that would serve to give sensation and motor control to the lower legs, So yeah, so it was an interesting idea. This idea that that Stegosaurus would need a second brain to make up for its tiny head brain, but we now know that that's very unlikely and probably not true.
Would Triceratops's frill have affected the placement of its brain?
That's a great question. So the brain of Triceratops is pretty much where we expect it to be. It's you know, behind the eyes, it's behind the nasal or nose cavity, and it's going to be sitting between that area behind the eyes and then towards the neck. So it's not really in a weird place, but you're right that the frill would have sort of extended from the back of the head, sort of back and sides of the head off, and protected the brain as well as the back of the neck. And we also know that the frill was probably serving multiple purposes, potentially as a display structure, so that, you know, that animal could communicate different things to other animals, and probably also serving to allow for some degree of like body temperature control, although that's less likely. And so yeah, the frill probably did multiple things, but it definitely sat above and near the brain, but it didn't really affect the position. Now, I think a more interesting potentially question is whether it affected the size and shape of the brain. And I can say that the shape of the brain is actually pretty typical of a lot of dinosaurs. So let me show you this. I promised props, so here we go. So I'll turn it how we had right before. So this is the nose end. This is the back end. We've got our nerves in yellow. We've got our inner ear in pink. We've got our, is it in focus? Let me know. We've got our dark blue veins and our red arteries, right? And so actually the shape of this brain is really typical of a lot of animals, including dinosaurs and alligators. This is really very much like an alligator brain. And so this is Triceratops. This is not a full-grown Triceratops. This is like a teenager, subadult, the brain of that. But this is a 3D print of that cavity space. And it's life-sized. So you can see we would have had like 1 walnut, 2 walnuts fitting inside there. You know, whether or not the frill affected the size of this brain is an interesting question. To my knowledge, that's never been asked in the research literature before. We do know that the elements of the head interact with one another to create different changes across evolution in the size and shape of different structures. For instance, we suspect, and there's some evidence to suggest that in animals that have great big jaw muscles, that probably limits the amount of space in the head that can be devoted to brain size. So whether or not the frill is similar to jaw muscles in limiting the size of the brain is a good question. It would definitely be one that you'd have to look at things like weight bearing, because the frill would have been quite large and quite heavy in certain individuals. And so it wouldn't necessarily be the frill like pushing down on the brain cavity. It would be more that the frill would have to be supported by the other skull bones. And those skull bones and other neck musculature and things that are going on to support that frill would have to be sturdy enough to do that. So you can't, a lot of times when we think about brains expanding in size across a different group throughout the evolution of that group, a lot of times that creates a thinning effect of the skull bones around the brain. And so in order for the brain to expand, perhaps I can't say for sure, because like I said, it hasn't been researched to my knowledge, but perhaps the frill needing to be supported by the head and neck would put limitations on how thin those skull bones could be, which potentially could limit the size of the brain. That's a really wonderful question, and I don't think anybody's actually looked at that. So please, you know, if you're looking to become a paleontologist, that's a wonderful question that has not yet been answered. So I invite you to talk more with me, or, you know, seek out those answers in your own work.
All right, how about a little bit of a pop culture question here? Now, in the movie Jurassic Park, they tell us, don't move. T-Rex's vision is based on movement. What does T-Rex's brain tell us? Is this true? Is this false?
Okay, so that's a great question. I suspect that the reason why they included that trait of the Jurassic Park T-Rex, this idea that, you know, it can't see you unless you move. So there are some reptiles that are not closely related to dinosaurs whose vision is very attuned to movement. Now that doesn't mean that they are blind without movement, but it means that when things around them move, their brain is highly sensitive to picking up those movements. And then also the coordination of their bodies and their heads is well matched to react to that movement. So to my knowledge, there's no animal in nature that is basically blind to still objects. So anyway, it just created drama, right? Created drama for the movie. So, but what we do know about an animal like T-Rex, based on what we see in birds and alligators, and also based on what we see for its brain cavity, is that its brain was doing a lot of really interesting things. So its visual system was likely not based on movement. It was likely much more like what we are used to with our own eyes, with the exception of it may have seen a greater array of colors, which is interesting based on what we know about the eyes of birds. So it's possible that it was able to see things in more detail than we are. And it definitely would have seen Dr. Grant and Lex in front of that Jeep. What's also hilarious about that scene is that when the T-Rex is investigating them, it takes a great big deep breath and exhales, and it blows Dr. Grant's hat off of his head. And that is hilarious to somebody like me, because when you look at the brain cavity of T-Rex, its olfactory area, right? So this is Triceratops, but we're going to pretend that this is T-Rex. So its olfactory area up front here, this is where the area for smell processing is, this olfactory center. So in Triceratops, it's kind of narrow and thin and skinny, but in T-Rex, it's quite wide, right? So I'm going to show you front side, right? So it's like more like that. And what that indicates to somebody like me is that it had a really acute sense of smell. It had a really excellent sense of smell. And so the idea of T-Rex not only being able to see Dr. Grant and Lex, but smell them too. I mean, they were goners. Like, there's no way. Like that, what happened to the lawyer would have happened to them at the end. Okay.
That actually works pretty well with my lizards too. I have a predatory leopard gecko at home, and she will not touch food unless it's moving because she's super picky. And
Yep.
my bearded dragon, who will eat anything, you just give him a bowl of food and she's like, nom, 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 he doesn't care. So kind of funny. We have one on how far can dinosaurs see?
So I'm actually not an expert on the visual system of dinosaurs. There are other paleontologists. One of my colleagues, Don Sirio, and others have done some really excellent work on the vision of dinosaurs. Now, I think it's actually kind of hard to gauge, and you'd have to talk to them, but it's hard to gauge distance vision. What's in dinosaurs, what's largely been studied are things like whether or not the field of vision in front of you is really, really wide, or whether or not it overlaps in front of you. So see, we have our two eyes in humans that face forward, which means that if you close one eye and then you look at the other eye, the areas that you can see in front of you sort of overlap. So that overlapping field of vision, it creates the ability for you to see things in really good, three-dimensional ways. So your what's called depth perception, your ability to sort of see objects in 3 dimensions in front of you, really takes shape. If you're like an animal like a white-tailed deer that has its eyes on the side of its head, or like a rabbit, their field of vision is really wide, right? They can see all around them, but that visual field doesn't overlap. And so they can see a lot, but their ability to see things in 3 dimensions is not as good. So a lot of times when we study dinosaur vision, I use royal we, I don't actually do that, but paleontologists, they're looking at whether or not dinosaurs have that wide field of vision or that sort of more narrow field of vision that overlaps. And when we see overlapping fields of vision, a lot of times what that is an indication of is like predatory behavior. So for instance, T-Rex has its eyes both facing fairly forward and has that overlap in its visual system. And so one of the things, it's sort of a piece of evidence along with its giant teeth that indicate that it was snacking on other dinosaurs and not on plants. And we see that in things like, we see that overlapping vision in things like predatory birds today. So we see that in hawks and eagles and owls. And we see it in mammals, in predatory mammals as well. So yeah. So sorry to not be able to answer your distance question, but hopefully that was at least kind of an insight into what we do know about the vision of dinosaurs.
I've got a bunch of questions, but I'm going to try and just reduce it down to a couple that are related. Okay. First of all, what is your sample size for either family or genera of different dinosaurs? Yep. Is it big? Is it small? And related to that, do you see any trends, whether the herbivores have larger brains than the carnivores, or the ornithischians are doing something different than the saurischians? Something like, just, can you just expand upon that?
Sure, for sure. Okay, so so this is for those geeks out there, right? We're gonna get technical. So yes. So for my dissertation, I looked at 15 different genera of dinosaurs, and within those genera, I actually don't know how many species. I should look that back up. But the sample size was as close to statistically useful as possible. It was not very big. It was close to 30. And so I can tell you that we are building on that sample size in order to be able to look for trends. So a lot of the work that's been done up to this point has been largely qualitative. And so, starting in, the late 1800s, ramping up in like the 1940s, 30s and 40s, kind of slowing down in the 60s, and then picking back up again with the dinosaur renaissance. You see a lot of these different fits and spurts of qualitative description of endocranial cavities. And what we see are things like in hadrosaurs, we see enlargement of the cerebrum and enlargement of the brain overall. In Stegosaurus, that's kind of Joe Sauropsid, not a whole lot going on there. In Pachycephalosaurs, you see expansion of the cerebrum and of the olfactory centers, but that's all fairly modest. But that's probably due to the fact that they're, in most cases, fairly small-bodied animals in general. So their expansion is actually, in a relative sense, fairly dramatic, but it's in an absolute sense not so much because they're just small animals. When you look to basal ceratopsians, they are really not doing much. So something like a protoceratops, its brain is very reptilian and very boring. Sorry. But when you start to look at larger bodied ceratopsians, actually they maintain that kind of boring plan, but they expand things probably due to body size. What's more interesting in ceratopsians, in my opinion, is the ability to trace features across ontogeny. So for instance, and I'm gonna bring my props back. So here is the here's the endocast of still a subadult, but a younger, less mature subadult. And you can kind of see that it has this like S curve to it. So it starts up top here and then curves into an S. And then as the animal matures and ages, we end up with less of an S curve and more of an elongate endocranial cavity. And so, this sort of elongation and loss of the S curve is something that I'm actually studying actively in the work that we're doing right now, because being able to study brain ontogeny has all kinds of implications for things like energy use, and even like telling species apart. So taxonomy, things like that. Let's see what else. For sauropods, we see their endocranial cavities are fairly squat. So kind of more like the younger Triceratops here. Everything's kind of compact. The S curve is there. But that probably is a function of the fact that their skulls are kind of, with the exception of something like Diplodocus, their skulls are kind of compact and more spherical in shape than some other dinosaur groups. And also in some cases, their nasal cavities are expanded. So there's, like I said, there's interplay between different features of the head and the size and shape of the brain. And so teasing apart, what is specific to changes in brain shape and size is sometimes difficult when you have other simultaneous changes going on elsewhere in the head. And that's when you get into things like modularity studies, which we haven't done, but I think would be really exciting. Brian Felice, give me a call. And then, when we look at theropod dinosaurs, they actually are pretty typical reptilian brains until you get close to sort of the threshold of looking at flight. And so they're very much elongate, rock-like, until you see transitions in the body that are interesting. So there's a hypothesis for a while that the brain sort of evolved to have changes that were like an onboard flight computer that readied the animal for flight. But that hypothesis has not been supported with the evidence, and what we're seeing is that the flight features of the body tend to show up, and then the brain responds. And when I talk about, flight brain, what that means is a larger cerebrum, some interesting things going on with a part of the cerebellum called the flocculus, which is involved with reflexes of the head and neck, and also sensations that are picked up from the skin of the wing. And so, yeah, all of those questions are still very much of interest to paleontologists. And the hard part is that skulls, depending on the taxon, skulls can tend to be fairly rare relative to other fossil material. And even when we do find them, they might not be complete enough or in good enough shape. They might be pancaked, so that studying the endocranial cavity, the brain cavity, is maybe not possible. So we kind of have to take what we get from the fossil record. We have skulls that are complete enough and not deformed so much that we can actually see features of that brain cavity. So in terms of sample size, it does depend on the group. So of course we have here in North America, we have a really rich fossil record for something like Triceratops, which is why I'm doing so much work with them, because we actually have something that's potentially statistically significant. And we also have a lot of detailed information about about their postcrania, the skeleton that's not the skull, part of the skeleton that's not the skull. And then we also have information about their ecology, the ecosystem they were living in, their different growth stages as they grew up from baby to adult. So we have all kinds of good information. It's a really rich sample relative to other taxa. So yeah, it just depends on the group whether or not you can actually use statistics to say much. A lot of the work that I do and other paleoneurologists do is qualitative at this point, at least. Yeah.
Well, I guess I don't see any other questions popping up anywhere else. So thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. Definitely give us something to think about today.
Wonderful. Great. Well, thank you for having me, and I'm happy to visit anytime. And if you have questions and you'd like to contact me offline, my website is paleoneurology.com. So I'm sure we can post that in the comments. Yep. So that's my lab website. And I have my email address listed on there too. I'm also, our lab is the IO Dino Lab. As an indication that we do dinosaur work, and we also do work with staining with iodine, which is a totally unrelated thing. So you can use the @iodino handle to reach us on Twitter and also on Facebook. So we're available on different platforms and happy to chat. So, okay.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. Take care. Have a lovely morning.
Thank you. Mm-hmm. All right. Next up, next week we will be starting again on the on Monday again. It was going to be a shorter week, but we had a couple other people jump in. So Clint, you're going to have to remind me who's talking. I have no idea what our topic is on Monday. But we'll still be talking at 10 o'clock. And
on Monday, we will have Denver Fowler and Liz Friedman Fowler from the Badlands Dinosaur Museum in Dickinson joining us to talk about tyrannosaurs.
There we go. So Monday, come back, 10 o'clock, tyrannosaurs. All right. Thank you all for joining us, and have a wonderful weekend.
Bye-bye.